And I'd like to welcome you to our class this evening. It's going to be an exciting class. We're beginning a new book. This is the 8th book of Israel, part 2, having just completed part 1, Persecuted but Not Forsaken. This book begins with a dedication I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on. The Savior, the prophets, and the apostles, under inspiration of Yahweh, all spoke about the time period in which we are now living. Now, this was written in 2008. They all said that the last days of man's governments, which are held by the religion that sits on 7 hills, would do away with Yahweh's laws, would be the worst time of trouble in mankind's history. And yes, even our leaders today are susceptible to the things coming upon this earth. The inhabitants of the earth are now experiencing the worst diseases, food shortages, and economic conditions ever known. And has it improved since then? I think we'll find it has not, and it's going to get worse. You know, economic conditions are more than just dollars. It's quality of product also. And so we see a reduction in the quality of our lives because of the quality of the things that we obtain. They're not built to last, and it's like living with holes in your pockets. It's going to get worse because of the teachings against Yahweh's laws. Nuclear war will soon engulf the world, starting in and around the great river Euphrates. Also prophesied for this time period and taking place right now is a severe persecution against the only work of Yahweh on earth, to try and stop the preaching and publishing of Yahweh's laws. This is being orchestrated by deceived men and women, leaders of the people, who love the darkness rather than the light, because they have no more cloak to hide their sins. This is due to the greatest prophecy of all taking place in the last days, which is the work of the House of Yahweh, taking the message of Yahweh's kingdom to all nations. Yahweh's last anointed witness, Israel Hawkins, is the only man on the face of the earth who was prophesied in advance and authorized and commanded by Yahweh to take his name, Yahweh's name, and Yahweh's laws, the standard of perfection, to all the world. Yahweh also promised that in spite of the most severe persecution and all the reproaches that sinful mankind can heap up, the work of Yahweh done by Israel Hawkins in these last days would not be stopped. The message of the kingdom continues to go out to all the world, and before it's over, about 2 billion will be saved out of the Great Tribulation. The book you are now reading contains 6 months of Israel Hawkins' sermons. It's jammed full of great wisdom, knowledge, and understanding from the awesome mind of the Creator and the loving Heavenly Father Yahweh. If you will study this book diligently, you will learn exactly what to do, in the words of the great Apostle Kepha, to save yourselves from this perverse generation. And now, with great thanks, we dedicate this work to our Heavenly Father Yahweh, through Yahshua Messiah, the prophesied high priest and king over the house of Yahweh, being seeds of the last day's witness and the 7th Malach, Israel Hawkins. And now, without further delay, we present to you the words of the greatest teacher in the world, our beloved pastor and overseer, Israel Hawkins. And in these lessons, there is a disclaimer in the beginning to the reader. Some of the material in this book is X-rated, that is graphic. And what that's saying is the words create mental imagery in your mind. And physically explicit, which in this book, we don't, do obscene pictures or anything, but some of the descriptions can be rather gross, describing the results of sin upon mankind. The idea is to paint a clear and precise picture that will assist in remembering the lesson or the information brought out. We advise that such content be handled appropriately. And by handling things appropriately, we mean teaching properly without exposing nakedness inappropriately. Chapter 1 is entitled STDs, the breaking of Yahweh's laws, cause cancer and many other curses that the world is now suffering. And this sermon was given on 7th month, 5th day of 2008. Now, if you were 10 years old at that time, and I know a few of you, that was 12 years ago, so you'd be 22 years old today. So how's it going? In all that time, the House of Yahweh has corrected and scolded and taught, and taught those 10-year-olds some things they didn't want to hear. But we tried to teach, the righteousness according to Yahweh's laws. And of course, it stirs up rebellion sometimes because of the carnal mind. But I would ask you, in that time, now that you've come to this point in your life, who has really told you the truth and really who has lied to you? Has not what Yahweh said would occur has occurred in your life? If you have made wise decisions, you've borne the righteous benefits of Yahweh's laws, working and acting in your life. And if you've made foolish decisions, you're probably noticing the suffering that's bringing to your life. The House of Yahweh only reveals the truth from the sacred scriptures that Yahweh has given us for our instruction and edification and guidance. So, Pastor speaks of the children and how important it is to teach them correctly. The children are so interested, he goes on to say in verse 2, in the learning process here and in the way it's presented. And what the teacher does to present instruction makes a big difference for a child. And so our teachers have been learning how to properly and respectfully maintain control of a classroom and to encourage and motivate young people to listen to the wisdom of Yahweh, because it's not something that's, always easily accepted. You'd be surprised how much better it makes things at home when a child is taught the 10 Commandments. He gives us an example. And I can attest to this, along with the Proverbs. In my life, because this was taught to me as a youth, those scriptures came to my mind and kept me out of trouble. In many cases, it set forth a standard. It sets forth a standard in a child's mind when they have a conscience to answer to. And that conscience is there to protect us. I need to bring you something on health, too, he goes on to say. I do believe that when they started taking iodine out of the foods and out of the wheat, now Pastor had some experience with this in his youth, how they would separate the parts of the wheat out in order to market it for sale, for profit. So it's kind of a cultural thing as well as a profitability thing to take extracts from foods or break things apart or create artificial substances that taste like food, to expand the market. And he says it really puzzled me why they were doing it. It's almost like there was an attack on the food supply. But then a host of new diseases developed when this started taking place. And he was speaking of the refining of wheat and how they took it away from Yahweh's original creation and started tinkering with it to make it more profitable and more culturally acceptable, the delicacies of the king's lifestyle. But iodine, he gave as an example here, is one of the things that looks like you really need to put back in your body. And anyone who's studied a little on health these days knows that there's a lot of nutrition missing from the foods we eat. And so there's many things that we have to pay attention to in order to put back into our body what's being taken out of them through lack of proper nutrition or lack of or stress from our environment and so forth. Because if you're deficient in it, that's what the health books are showing. They all show that this deficiency exists, and there's ways that Yahweh gave you to protect your body. Now, I had a thought come to mind here about restoring what is missing in the body, restoring what greed and sin have removed. Now, I had a thought in my mind that Yahweh created the creation in Genesis perfect. But when I went to the scriptures, and I only had access to the Strong's, it uses words. In the King James, it used the word good, but in the book of Yahweh, it was translated fitting or right. And so there in Genesis 1, verse 11 and 12, it uses the word right or fitting, and they're both the same word, Hebrew 28:96. And it means, among other things, but it means beautiful, best, better, bountiful, cheerful, at ease, fine, glad, joyful, kindly, kindness, most pleasant, pleasure. So what we're seeing in this word here is that Yahweh created the creation, something that was beneficial, that was capable of bringing forth pleasure. They use the word prosperity, but wealth, and also welfare. In other words, mankind obtains what we need from the environment, from the earth, for our benefit and our welfare. But it doesn't say perfect. So then I looked, this word comes from the Hebrew word 2895, which is the primitive root, and means to do or make well in the widest sense. So it's a broad term here, to be or to do better. And you think about our walk in the house of Yahweh, how it is our desire to improve ourselves, to please, to do well, or to go well. In Genesis 1:31, we see the term very right, is Hebrew 39:66. Yahweh saw all that he had created, and he saw that it was very right, meaning very or exceedingly and greatly. So it's kind of like Yahweh's crowning achievement here. This is the beginning of his plan with mankind, not the very beginning of the planning, but the beginning of starting to implement this great plan. Now let me read through some scriptures quickly about what is truly beneficial and truly perfect. Psalm 85:12, yes, Yahweh will give that which is beneficial, and our land will yield its increase. Luke 12:23-31, the life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. So do not seek continually for what you will eat or what you'll drink, neither be of a doubting mind. For all these things the nation of the world seek after, and your Father knows you have need of those things. But rather seek the kingdom of Yahweh, then these things will be added to you. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's righteous pleasure to give you the kingdom. If there be great tribulation upon the earth, it comes not by the keeping of Yahweh's word, but through the wickedness of man. And then we have Deuteronomy 31:19, 22, 24 and 29, and I didn't get that written down, but well, that's probably because I was going to read it. Deuteronomy 31, 19. Now, Yahweh finishes off in verse 18 saying, because of the evil they have done by turning it to hinder gods. Now this perfect law is therefore written for you. Teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, so that I have this perfect law bearing witness for those who reverence Yahweh. Verse 22, so Moshe wrote down this perfect law that day and taught it to the children of Israel. In verse 24, when Moshe had completed writing the law in the book, from the beginning to the end. And then verse 29, for I know after my death you will become utterly corrupt, and you will turn from the way I've commanded you. Evil will befall you in the latter days. And that's the time we're living in now, that's Pastor is speaking of in this sermon. Because you will do evil in the sight of Yahweh. And then that continues. In Psalm 18:30, as for Yahweh, his way is perfect. The law of Yahweh is tried. He is a buckler to all those who trust him. For who is the mighty one except Yahweh? Who is the rock except our Father? In Matthew 5:48, therefore become perfect, just as your Father who is in heaven is perfect. In Psalm 18:30 through 32, as for Yahweh, his way is perfect. The law of Yahweh is tried. He is a buckler to all those who trust in him. For who is the mighty one except Yahweh? I guess I just read that. In verse 32, it is Yahweh who arms us with strength and who makes our way perfect. So in the beginning, we see what the plan of Yahweh was to create man in his image and likeness, in his character. Deuteronomy 8:2 and 3. And this is what Yeshua Messiah quoted in Matthew and Luke 4 verse 4 in each case. You must remember that Yahweh your Father led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness in order to humble you, to test and to prove you. And this is what is occurring with us now, being tested and proven, so to know what is in your heart, to see whether you would keep his law or whether you would not. That's the test for each individual. So he humbled you and allowed you to hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know of, or your fathers did not know of it, so he might make you know that man does not live by bread only. So it's not just about food and clothing and so forth, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh does man live. Deuteronomy 32:3 and 4, for I will proclaim Yahweh's great name, praise the greatness of Yahweh. He is the rock, his works are perfect. Yahweh's ways are justice indeed. He is the Father of truth and does no wrong. Upright and just is he. Psalm 19:7, the laws of Yahweh are perfect, converting the whole person. And so by abiding in the laws and applying them in your life, you will be converted, your whole body, into one of health and the joyous and abundant living that Yahweh has planned in store for us in his under his rulership of his laws. Romans 8:18 through 22. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the revealing of the sons of Yahweh. For the creation was made subject to emptiness, not willingly, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope. So Yahweh created this world that we are living in for our well-being, for our care, even for wealth. But how do we use it? And it should be used. And we should improve our lives, and we should take care of our health. But remember our priorities and what's most important. Because Yahweh has created this as a training ground. It's not perfect the way Yahweh, what he has in store for us, what we're heading for. what's in store for us. Because the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of corruption into this glorious liberty by the children of Yahweh, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor of childbirth right up until this present time in these last days. So all of these things Yahweh has shown us in prophecies, why these things are taking place among mankind, these troubles. And of course, in this time, any holiness that we try to bring forth brings persecution and resistance, even the use of the name of Yahweh. But even that's changing, and it's in the mouths of more and more people now. And Pastor brings us this news in these sermons because he wants us to catch on to the fact that we're in a time period that was prophesied. And he even pinpoints this very time. We know that breaking of Yahweh's laws confuses the minds of the people. Any time you depart from the perfect way of Yahweh, it's confusion. If you can see Yahweh's plan, you should carry it out. You should carry it with you at all times and keep it in mind. Be counting our blessings. Try to get a longer picture of what we're a part of. When you leave, after services, after the classes, think on these things. Discuss these things with your friends, your family. Take to heart the lesson that is being taught to you. Try to add to that message. Go over it again and again. Let it sink in and try to improve yourself. Be a profitable servant. Know that Yahweh is calling you out of this world to keep you from the suffering, from the sicknesses and the diseases that we bring upon our own selves by the transgression of Yahweh's laws. Revelation 18:1-5 tells us to come out of the world so that we do not be partakers of its sins. At this point in the sermon, Pastor goes through some articles and statistics on the AIDS virus, herpes, many sexually transmitted diseases, epidemics in nations. And this is what we're being called to come out from and to be separate from, as much as it's possible within us to separate from what we've learned and know is unclean, that which defiles the mind and the body. Yahaqob chapter 18, it tells us that if you turn from this righteousness that Yahweh's giving you, worse things will come upon us. So just know that Yahweh is not ignoring his creation, but he's watching out for us very closely. Now, you can read on your own Leviticus 18 and Exodus 20. You can compare these laws of Leviticus 18, where it says, do not do certain things regarding relations between people. And in Exodus 20, you also read, to do these things or do not do these other things. They read the same. And so that ought to be a hint. They're all the laws of Yahweh. And so Pastor, from the Scriptures, has been putting it out there, what to look for in these diseases, and to trace it back, according to Leviticus 18, to the sin. Okay? You've got to look at man's behavior. Some of it's not beneficial, but it's not necessarily sinful. But, you really have to trust in Yahweh with these things, because experience can't always tell you when these diseases are there to come upon you, because they can't always be detected. And sometimes our behaviors, can put us in environments that are not beneficial and can lead to, remember Abraham, the story of Abraham, where Yahweh got him up and away from his family. So there wouldn't be that influence to drag him back into the world. And Yahweh's done great things, and he has great things in store for him and Yahweh's family. Something to point out here about these viruses, it's caused by these STDs caused by viruses. The scriptures calls those things abominations. We read of that, once again, Leviticus 18 and Exodus 20. Moving right along, let's see, back up a little bit here. Oh, yes. And this virus right here you get from breaking one of Yahweh's laws. This was a virus that causes cancers and tumors. They find these viruses in the tumors of these cancers. So they know there's a relationship there. They're existing together. And this virus right here that you get from breaking one of the laws in Leviticus 18 or one of the laws in Exodus 20, viruses that you pick up, now you can cause them to enter your body. And this was a study put on by in Israel, in Beersheba. And this is a place that Pastor points out. If you want to read about a little history on Beit Yahweh and the name, the House of Yahweh, how the House of Yahweh, how Pastor or Israel was inspired with the name for the last day's work, the House of Yahweh. He gives a little history here how this came about. Continuing with this analysis of these tumors, they even found evidence of measles, a virus protein in about half of their samples, and they saw a possible association between the measles virus and a cancer of the lymph tissue called Hodgkin's disease. Measles was a disease or a virus that was found and is still found today in pork and swine, which we know from Leviticus and other scriptures that this is an unclean meat that was not meant to be a food for mankind. It's not suitable for mankind. So Pastor brings this information in the hopes that it will educate us and enlighten us to make wise choices, to improve our lives, to separate ourselves from these abominations, so we don't bring this suffering and don't bring this confusion into our own lives. It's been a pleasure to serve you this evening, and I'd like to turn the class over now to our great priest, great Kohan Matithya, to continue in this great lesson and to bless you on this soon. We're rolling into the Sabbath and the feast very soon. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, great Kohan. Hey, Shabbat Shalom, great men of Yahweh. Please be seated. Yahweh's peace be with each and every one of you. We are going to continue on here in chapter 1 of the 8th book of Yisrayl, part 2, Persecuted but Not Forsaken. This series of sermons that Pastor gave seems like a few years ago, but it's been a little while now, as the great priest was saying before me, about 12 years ago. We're going to be picking up here on page 6 of the 8th book of Yisrayl, part 2. Or if you're following along in the Yisrayl Says program, it's going to be chapter 1 of the 8th book of Yisrayl, part 2, and verse 52. Continuing on here with this sermon that Pastor entitled, STDs, the breaking of Yahweh's laws causes cancer and many other curses that the world is now suffering. And we see here how in just a couple of short years, how mankind has even come to a point now where they're in a more dire situation than what Pastor was referring to here in this series of sermons with some of their diseases they have with these plagues that are befalling mankind at this time. Pastor says in verse 52, I know if you read our book, Health Yahweh's Way, we covered the clean and the unclean in there. And I talked a lot at that time about information that I got in the 50s when I was working in the State Board of Health Laboratories. You can see how Yahweh's raised up his servant Yisrayl Hawkins, how he raised him up and trained him to be able to have this wisdom and knowledge of even the scientific community to go along with his wisdom and knowledge of the scriptures to see how Yahweh's way works and to see the importance in keeping Yahweh's laws. And of course, this was a going thing at that time. Trichnosis, the worm trichina that you get from eating pork. You know, and all you hear about pork eating and smoked ham and the good old bacon, right, they call it. You never hear people talking about worms in pork or in swine's flesh. But this trichnosis worm you get from eating pork, but also you can get the larva by hugging a pig, kissing a pig if you want to. And you can get the larva then, and it hatches out in the stomach, and then you get a big enough dose of it, and it can kill you. If it hatches out all at once, it attacks your inward parts, and it can kill you very easily. So you can see here how deadly it is to go against what Yahweh instructed. And Pastor's going to continue on here. In verse 54, he says, if you turn over to Leviticus chapter 11, I'm going to go through this totally because we want this sermon to go on the television. I want everyone to notice what I'm saying because today I doubt very seriously if 1% of the people know that the Holy Scriptures that they, the world, the religions of the world claim to live by, know that this verse is here, but it's throughout the Holy Scriptures. Okay, so you can see Pastor bringing this message of warning to this dying world, showing what the Scriptures show, the instructions Yahweh gave of how to live a clean, healthy lifestyle. And those who do know about it, and they ask their preachers, the preachers tell them, well, Jesus came to cleanse the pig. And of course, Pastor says, he did a poor job of it, because that sucker is really infected. Worse today than he was then. Laughing, praise Yahweh. We better get him to come back and work on him again, I think. And I guess this goes along with Christianity's idea of Jesus returning, right? He's going to come back and fix that pig properly. Now, we can see the deception here that's being taught in the religions today. Well, in Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 7, it says, and the pig, although it has a split hoof, completely divided, yet it does not chew the cud, which is a sign that it's unclean to you, Pastor says, okay, that it does not chew the cud. Leviticus 11 verse 8, their meat you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. One of the apostles said, and I think it's 1 Corinthians, touch not. Now let's go over to Isaiah 66. But the apostle said, touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. Notice he says, it's unclean unto you. The pig, pork, is unclean unto you. Okay, so you can see how Yahweh shows and he gives instructions on certain things you are not supposed to touch, certain things you are not supposed to eat or consume. Now, Pastor goes on here, says the measles virus comes from pork, from eating pork, from handling a dead pig. It will get to you because it comes immediately off of them when the pig dies. Now, continuing on here, we're going to be skipping through verses 58 through 71 pretty briefly here, and we're just going to be reading here the scripture in Isaiah chapter 66, starting in verse 17. They who sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens, following after the priests in the midst of those who eat swine's flesh. Not Yahweh's priests, these priests who are the ones that consume swine's flesh, that which is offered to gods, and the rodent will be consumed together, says Yahweh. Okay? So those who sanctify themselves, who purify themselves, and they partake of the swine's flesh and the things offered to the gods, and the rodents, they will be consumed together, says Yahweh. Seeing how important it is for us to be separate from God worship. We don't want to be caught up in this consumption that's coming upon mankind because they reject Yahweh's wisdom, because they take into themselves, whether physically eating things or mentally and spiritually taking in a different message other than this is the way, walk you in it. This is the path to life. Keep these laws. Now, if you go back to Isaiah 65 in verse 2, it says, I have spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people. Okay, so you can see the conduct of the people. You can see the mentality, rebellion, a rebellious people. This is something that's very prominent in today's society, where people rebel against everything. It used to be people would only rebel if you were trying to guide them in following the scriptures, or if you were trying to guide them in doing something that you needed them to accomplish, possibly with children or with, people who were just opposed to the way you were trying to get them to go. But now in society, you can see rebellion is just in everything. People don't want to, they don't want to wear a mask when they go in the store if the government tells them to. They don't want to stay home if the government tells them to. They don't want to go out and go here or there when the government tells them to. The rebellion amongst the people is just increasing daily, to where those in authority figures in society today, in the municipalities and the cities and the states and the countries, they're at a loss for how to deal with the people, because they don't know how to deal with this rebellion. How do you try to get someone to do what you're telling them to when they just utterly refuse to do what you're instructing them? But Yahweh says, I have spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people who walk in a way which is not right, after their own thoughts. Okay, it's their own thoughts, their own thinking. Remember Isaiah 55 and verse 8. Isaiah 55 verse 8, Yahweh says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. Okay, so these people go after their own thoughts. And Yahweh says, his thoughts, his ways are not the way we think, the way we go. We have to come into unity, come into submission with his laws. That's why Yahweh sends the priest. He sends us the great priest to teach us righteousness, so we know what we are to do and what we should not do. Isaiah 65 and verse 4, who assemble and spend the night keeping memorials for the dead. This is Halloween. Practicing Halloween or celebrating the pagan festival of Halloween, which is just weeks away now, where all the world, will be celebrating these pagan holidays. Who eat swine's flesh, and the broth of abominable things is in their vessels. Okay, so you can see the partaking of these foods, the consuming of these things which Yahweh instructs, you should not do this, you should not partake of this, don't touch it, don't eat it. The doing of that actually starts changing your blood. It puts these things into your vessels, which bring down the body. And how fitting with what we see here recently in the news, where we see with the COVID and the coronavirus, where they're talking about this is a blood virus. This is something that's in the blood of the people. Okay, well, because they have a certain mark. They have the mark of the beast, this way of Satan, this opposition against Yahweh's righteousness. These things are in their vessels. It's a part of their genetics, their DNA, and a part of their blood supply. Isaiah 65 verse 5, who say, stand by yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. They are a smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all the day. So Yahweh finds no pleasure in these religious institutions who are exalting themselves and turning from his laws. Now, let's go back in verse 70 and 71 here, pastors. Let's go back to Exodus 31. Notice here that Yahweh sanctifies his people. Okay, remember what we read there in Isaiah 65? They sanctify themselves. Okay, this is something that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, has admitted to time and time again, that they choose to keep and follow certain things, and they choose to do away with certain things, and they do it of their own will, and their God has instructed them down, so they have the authority to do so. Okay, they're sanctifying themselves. They're not partaking in Yahweh's holy teachings and instructions and the mark of Yahweh. They're not keeping Yahweh's laws. They're sanctifying themselves in opposition against Yahweh's way. Look here in Exodus 31, though, that Yahweh sanctifies his people. Okay, how you can tell the people of Yahweh from the people of Satan. And there's no in between. You're either for Yahweh's kingdom, following Yahweh's kingdom, humbling yourself to Yahweh's kingdom, or you're for Satan's kingdom, going about with your own thoughts, your own ways. The way Yahweh sanctifies you, of course, is by teaching you his laws. And he says in Exodus 31 and verse 13, Exodus 31 and verse 13, he says, "Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for they are a sign." Pastor says, they are a sign of what? A sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies you, who sets you apart for a job. This is Exodus 31, verse 13, found on page 71 of your book of Yahweh, which is interesting because this is verse 71 of chapter 1 here, but Exodus 31, 13, found on page 71 in your book of Yahweh. Now, in verse 72 of the chapter 1, 8th book of Israel, part 2, he says, "My Sabbaths you shall keep, for they are a sign." Yahweh's Sabbaths, his holy days, his Sabbaths, his weekly Sabbath, and his feast days. Yahweh's Sabbaths, not man-made traditions, not following days set by the religions, going about sanctifying themselves. Yahweh's Sabbaths are a sign. They are a sign of obedience, in fact, Pastor says, between me and you. These things show whether we belong to Yahweh or whether we belong to Satan the adversary. Anyone who wants to keep my Sabbaths, if you remember, Pastor says, he says to Israel, he said, if a Gentile wants to come into the camp, let him be circumcised and let him keep my Sabbath, and he will have a name equal to sons and daughters. Anyone who wants to be a part of Yahweh's kingdom, it's not barred from anyone. The only thing, they must keep his laws, the same as anyone else. Okay, so you can see there's nothing holding us back from being Yahweh's sons. Okay, there's nothing that holds us back from it. It's an offer that Yahweh gives to those who would obey and keep his laws and turn from their wicked way. Verse 73, he says, continuing on in Exodus 31:13, "It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies." Pastor says, sets you apart for a holy use. That's what the word sanctifies means. Sets you apart for a holy use. Okay? To be sanctified by Yahweh means you're set apart for a holy use. This is one of the jobs of pastor in these last days, is to set aside, prepare a holy people. Okay? A holy people. Those who actually love to keep Yahweh's laws. Not just a righteous people, not just those that keep Yahweh's laws, but a holy people, those who love the keeping of Yahweh's laws. Remember what pastors taught us about the difference between righteousness and holiness. Holiness is the loving to keep Yahweh's laws, that desire, that zeal that burns within you to keep Yahweh's laws, the excitement that comes from it. And this is Yahweh who sanctifies us. When we keep his Sabbaths, he sanctifies us. He sets us apart for a holy use. That's what the word sanctifies means. Sanctifies means, or sanctifies you. I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. How does Yahweh set us apart for a holy use? By teaching you the laws, of course, Pastor shows. By teaching you the laws. That's how you're set aside, by being taught, by receiving this information that is coming from Yahweh through his anointed servant. Now keep that in mind, and we're going to jump over here to verse 85. Pastor's reading in 1 Yahaqob, and he started in verse chapter 3 and verse 4, but we're going to pick up here in 1 Yahaqob 3 verse 10. "In this, the children of Yahweh are manifest." Pastor says if a person is not keeping his laws, they're not coming to Yahweh's house. If they're not keeping the holy Sabbath, they're not sanctified by Yahweh. They're not sanctified by the Creator. Okay, so you can see here that if you're not keeping Yahweh's laws, you are not being set apart as holy. You have to keep those laws. Just hearing them is not enough. Not just the hearers of the law will be justified, it's the doers, those who are actually going to keep Yahweh's laws. They're going to keep his holy days, keep his Sabbaths and his feast. Those who humble themselves to come to his house. And we have to be mindful. Of course, we know there's those who are being held back in prisons or foreign countries or different situations that they're being forced back, but we have to be obedient in keeping Yahweh's Sabbaths and his feast days, and Yahweh's made it so easy in these last days to be able to tune in, reach in, to connect to the house of Yahweh, and unless, and of course, through counsel, you'll find this out through counsel with the great priest in the house of Yahweh. You'll find out if there's a reason that you're actually being held back, or you're just making excuses for not getting to the house of Yahweh. We have to get rid of excuses, man. We have to make sure that we're humbly obeying what Yahweh's instructed us and getting to his house to keep his Sabbaths and his feast days, so we can be sanctified, so we can be set apart for a holy use. Now, jumping over here to verse 98, we're going to go back to 1 Yahaqob 2 verse 20. 1 Yahaqob 2 verse 20. As for you, your anointing, brethren, that is your calling, is from the Holy One. Okay, so we can see that, how do we learn about the house of Yahweh? How do we learn about Yisrayl Hawkins? Yahweh called us. He drew us out of this world. He allowed us to come upon this message. Sure, we might have just thought, it was an accident, or it just occurred, or, we might have been raised up in this way, and so, well, my parents were in the house of Yahweh, so I'm in the house of Yahweh. But Yahweh's actually called us, brethren. He's called us here to his house. 1 Yahaqob 2 verse 20, as for you, your anointing, brethren, that is your calling, is from the Holy One. Those who keep the laws of Yahweh, their calling is from the Holy One. And those who are obedient to the laws of Yahweh know this, that your calling is from Yahweh. He's offering you this job, a job that we're going to receive in just a few months now. Okay, so it wasn't by accident that we came across the teachings of the house of Yahweh. We ended up in the house of Yahweh. Yahweh called us here to his house. And we have to make sure we make our calling sure, that we're putting forth the effort, and we're choosing to allow Yahweh to work with us through his house. He's not going to come and work with us on our own. He's going to work with us through his house, through his priests, through the teachings that come forth from the great house of Yahweh. Now, jumping over here to verse 110. Verse 110, he's reading in Revelations chapter 18 and verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you do not partake of her sins. Okay, and this voice is only coming from the house of Yahweh. It's only coming from Yisrayl Hawkins. All 4,199 other religions are not telling you to separate yourself from sin. They might be telling you to separate yourself from this act or that act, or this activity or that activity, or these people or those people, but they're not saying to come out of her, my people, so that you do not partake of her sins. Sin is the breaking of the laws. So you do not partake of the breaking the laws along with her. The Sabbath, the eating of unclean foods, and so forth. Okay? These are the sins that make you belong to Satan. Breaking Yahweh's Sabbath day. Eating unclean foods. So, come out from her, my people, so you do not partake of her sins, and so you do not receive of her plagues. So you do not receive of these plagues that come with eating pork or breaking the other laws given by Yahweh. And this is why we, the house of Yahweh, we have the great blessing, we have the great blessing of not having to be worried about these plagues in the world today. It doesn't mean to touch these things. Remember we read earlier what we're going to get into here. Now we're about to get into it. Is we need to keep ourselves separate. We need to keep ourselves separate from the unclean. Don't think, well, I keep Yahweh's laws, so Yahweh's protecting me from these things. No, Yahweh's protection comes how? Through instructions, through teaching. And the house of Yahweh has given us many, many teachings for many, many years, and the world's just now trying to catch up to some of these things to try to lessen the effect of their plagues. But we don't need to be worried about these plagues. We need to be concerned with striving to overcome and to become perfect and righteous in Yahweh's sight, and continuing to keep these laws so we don't have to fall victim to these things. Plagues, curses, called sickness and disease today. One called Hodgkin's disease. Others called cancer of all kinds. So come out of her so you won't receive of these curses that come with sin. Notice verse 5. For her sins have reached into the heaven. And if you haven't read, or you might go back and reread, the articles that Pastor's written on global warming, the true cause of global warming, and how her sins have reached into the heavens. The world Look what Pastor says here. The world will go on in its stupidity until 4/5 of the earth's population is wiped out. And all the brilliant minds and the scientists and the great wealth of the world, and what do they do all the time? They blame global warming or coronavirus or this sickness or that sickness. They always try to blame it on something to make money off of, to make themselves some money, to fatten their pockets, to build their empires. They'd never stand up and say, man, we really messed up. We've been breaking Yahweh's laws. We need to repent. We need to turn to Yahweh's house. No, they don't do these things. And the world's going to continue in this stupidity until 4/5 of the earth's population is wiped out. It's going to take that great burning to actually get mankind to see that their way does not work. And this is what Yahweh's allowing. Yahweh's allowing mankind to go on in the stupidity so they can realize and the heavens and the earth can witness to the fact that sin has never brought peace. In verse 112, he says, now there's much more from every one of these. They're checking all the STDs now, and they're checking them with the diseases. We started telling them 40 years ago what they would find. Look in verse 113 here. We're just going to briefly cover this article he's reading here where it says viruses are very small organisms. Very small. You can't see them. Very small organisms. Most cannot even be seen with the ordinary microscopes. Not even with an ordinary microscope can you see these viruses. Little bitty, tiny, tiny, tiny pathogens. They consist of a small group of genes in the form of DNA and RNA. And then if you skip down here to verse 116, he says HPV, or human papillomavirus, and there's different forms of these viruses, but HPV, they have different kinds of, herpes simplex 1, herpes simplex 2. They have all these different numbers they give to them, but HPVs are a group of over 100 related viruses, and they're worried about one virus right now in society, but this is something mankind's been suffering with for many, many years, but they're a group of over 100 related viruses that can cause warts on the skin, mouth, and other vital or other sensitive organs. They are spread by contact. And look what Pastor says here, because remember what we just talked about earlier about keeping Yahweh's Sabbath puts a mark upon us. We don't have to worry about the plagues. But look at these. Diseases are spread by contact. That is, by touch. Okay? Including intimate relations. HPV infections are very common in people who are sexually active. They're very common in people, in adulterers and fornicators, is what they're telling you here, but in a polite way. So those transgressing the laws given in another chapter in Leviticus chapter 18. These things are spread through these things, but also through touch. And this is what mankind's starting to realize, that these viruses they've mutated and created and spread from the days of Cain to now. These things can be transmitted just by touch, by touching something after someone else touched it. This is why it's so important, man, to be diligent in following what the House of Yahweh teaches. And if you're not guarding yourselves and your families from this world, you really need to get with your counselors, and you need to get on a regiment to guard yourself and protect yourself from this sickness and from the disease that we see in the world today. Pastor says in verse 117, they're very common in the world today because the world is filled with fornication and adultery. Oh, yeah. They have this freedom to just do what they want to do. Freedom to do whatever they want to do, not realizing the misery they're bringing upon themselves. They never, and of course, the religions aren't telling them, the scientists, very few are telling them that, hey, this freedom to think you can just do whatever you want to do, it bites, and it bites very badly. It's also filled with pork eaters, swine eaters. Okay, so you can see how these sexually unlawful sexual acts mixed with unlawful eating of unclean foods, how these things mix together and they create these greater gods. And Yahweh says they're trying to sanctify themselves, but they're all going to be consumed. And he says, come out of her, my people, so you will not partake of this, and so you won't also partake of her plagues that come with it. Okay, you got to come out of these things so we don't partake of these plagues. And you can see here, you can see here how Pastor says here they're trying to sanctify themselves. So, oh, you're sick? Oh, you need to go to the doctor. The doctor will give you these pills, and you take those pills. And that helps you for so long. And then, oh, you got another sickness. You go back to the doctor, and you get another set of pills. And it's just this constant rotation of all these different medicines to try to alleviate the pain, the misery, the consequences that come from sin. And these things don't heal people. They don't cure people. They're like Band-Aids. They cover a problem, but these are really big problems that Band-Aids can't hold back. And that's what we're seeing here as we draw closer to mankind destroying themselves. We can see here how they're starting to realize, man, we have no idea what we're going to do to fix this problem. We have no idea what we're going to do. And so what do? They turn to the sorcerers. Hey, come on, make us something great that's going to fix us up. We want to go back to normal life. Now in verse 122 here in closing, Pastor says, now Yahweh said, because they wouldn't. Now get this here. Why do we see the misery taking place in the world today? It's not because Yahweh has any kind of hatred towards the world. Yahweh dislikes and hates sin, but he doesn't hate the people of the world. He desires that all would turn from their sins and repent and turn to righteousness. Now Yahweh said, because they wouldn't. This is in Romans chapter 1. He said, because they wouldn't retain me in their knowledge, because they wouldn't keep his laws. From Cain, who wouldn't follow Abel, to the elders of Israel who wouldn't follow Samuel, time and time again, Yahweh sent righteous teachers to teach mankind, and they reject the teacher. They reject the teaching. He said, because they wouldn't retain me in their knowledge, they gave up the great wisdom of Yahweh. Okay? Because they wouldn't keep Yahweh in their knowledge, they wanted kings, they wanted someone who had, a fancier thing going on. They gave up the great wisdom of Yahweh that he gave us in every book of Yahweh, all the Bibles. Even the King James Version has it. But they gave this up. They wouldn't retain it. So he said, I turned them over to a reprobate mind so they would do those things. They thought they were wise, and they thought they were conceited. They thought they were smarter than Yahweh. Now this is something mankind's failed in, since the days of Cain, thinking they're smarter than Yahweh, smarter than that teacher Yahweh sent. I know what I'm doing. Step out of my way. You're trying to hold me back from enjoying myself. I want to eat and drink and rise up to play. So he turned them over to this reprobate mind. So they started doing these things that brought sickness and diseases to all parts of their bodies. But they still won't repent, even after a third of man is killed over a fourth part of the earth in and around the great river Euphrates by nuclear activity. Now this is what you're going to see very, very soon now, and it's going to be precise. I believe the news media will actually figure this out, and they'll say, did you know that this has killed a third part of man? And maybe someone like Brian Ross will say, wasn't this what Yisrayl Hawkins said on my show? And Pastor's laughing. He says, gonna be precise and very soon. Okay, so we can see these things, men, are coming upon mankind because they've rejected Yahweh's laws. Now you, the great sons of Yahweh, in closing here, Yahweh gives us this promise in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3. It says, and those who are wise will shine as the brightness of the heavens, and those who turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Remember, that wisdom is the teachings that you're receiving from Yahweh's house. Those who teach this wisdom, they receive from Yahweh's house. You will be the ones that Yahweh refers to in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14 that stand with Yeshua, that were called, that were chosen, and that were faithful. And Yahweh bless your understanding, men.